Okay, so here we are, our last chapter, chapter 15. This is the Civil War. This is where we will end our class, and where if you take the class that's after this, it will pick up immediately after this with Reconstruction. All right, so some key questions to focus on. How did the economic and human resources of the North and South compare? We're going to get into that a lot because it's pretty much the main reason why the North ends up winning the Civil War. What were the Confederate and Union military strategies? What were the steps leading to the Emancipation Proclamation? Of course, very important in the development of the war, and of course, a huge important shift in our history. What was the impact of the war on Northern political, economic, and social life? How did military reversals affect Confederate political and economic life and civilian morale? And what was the meaning of the Civil War for the nation and its citizens? This is going to be the last war that is fought on our soil. And so this is very important to remember, that this is a war that's happening in our country, not happening over somewhere where we kind of hear about it and we vaguely understand what's going on. It is happening literally in people's backyards. That's where fighting is happening. And this is the last time to date that has occurred in our nation. So a little bit of review here from where we left off last time. How did the war begin? With the bombardment of Fort Sumter. So to review, when President Lincoln was inaugurated as the first Republican president in March of 1861, yes, it is now in January, but back then, because word did not travel as quickly and because you could not literally travel as quickly, it was pushed back, and it didn't often happen until March. Now it takes place in January. But anyway, it was not clear that he would use the military to challenge the South. Remember, the South, some southern states had ceded from the Union at this point, and it wasn't clear that Lincoln was going to challenge them militarily right away. He claimed he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it was, and whether or not that is true is up for debate. And he appealed for restraint, and he said this in regards to the South. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. Remember that he put the burden on South Carolina, saying, I'm going to send supplies to Fort Sumter. You do what you want to do. If you want to start a civil war, that's on you. It's not my responsibility. So to remember again, the status of two federal forts, mainly Fort Sumter and Charleston, were in the air because they were in Southern territory, and to the south they were foreign forts on their soil because they considered themselves no longer part of the United States, and so they didn't want to have some other country's military fort on their soil. So in response, South Carolina cut off supplies to Sumter, so Lincoln does send the supplies there, and South Carolina responds by firing on the fort. The fort is captured 2 days later, and this is the start of the Civil War. So Lincoln again puts it on the South and makes it their responsibility. After the fall of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln mobilized state militias for 90 days, as is his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. In response to this, in response to Lincoln's mobilization of the state militias, some additional states ceded from the Union, including Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. As seems to be the case at the beginning of all wars, and I don't know why, the general belief was that the war would be brief. Both sides felt, the North and the South, they each felt like, oh, we're going to win this thing. It'll be all over in a couple months, and, it won't be a big deal, and war will be great and glorious and victorious, and we'll come home heroes, and that was not the case. And that kind of attitude led to a lot of people to volunteer for military service. However, as the war drags on, as word about the conditions that the soldiers are living in and the probability of them dying in war starts to get back home, then that kind of enthusiasm fades, and both sides actually have to start drafting men into the army. So people tend to think of the Civil War as being slave states versus free states. not technically true because there were 4 slaveholding states that might have ceded from the Union and sided with their fellow slaveholding states, but for some shrewd politics on the side of Lincoln. So that's Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. They were all slaveholding states, and it is very important to note that these states remaining in the Union was hugely significant because the loss of these states would have increased the Confederate population by more than 50%. And as we'll see, one of the main advantages that the North had over the South was more manpower. And so this would have been taking away one of the North's biggest advantages. And in order to avoid alienating these states, Lincoln does put off emancipating the slaves for a time. So here you can see the map, which lists all the Union states are there in red. The border states are there in that kind of teal color. And then everything in gray and blue are those states that ceded from the Union and made up the Confederacy. So Lincoln used a lot of his executive power during the war, and he did things that a lot of people considered to be pretty controversial at the time. Lincoln has come to be, one of those beloved presidents in American history, but at the time, he was not universally liked by everybody. I mean, obviously he was assassinated, so clearly not everybody liked him, but also a lot of people they took issue with the powers that he exercised. But from his perspective, this was needed as we were in a war, and not just any war, but a civil war, fighting for our future as a nation. So he did things like call for 75,000 volunteers. He authorized a lot of government spending because, of course, wars are very expensive. And he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is an order that an accused person be brought to trial. And he suspended that due to concerns over soldiers captured from the South, spies, etc. So if we look at this chart here, you can see a comparison of the Union and Confederate control of key resources at the outset of the Civil War. The Union is in that greenish color and the Confederacy is in the purple color. And so clearly you can say here what the Union's advantage is going to be, and that is going to be resources. So let's get into that a little bit more. So the North's 2 main advantages are resources and manpower. Approximately half the men of military age are going to fight for the North, and significantly their numbers were supplemented by African Americans, free African Americans living in the North, and many slaves who are taking the opportunity to escape and come north to fight for the Union. Also, the immigrants coming in. Remember that immigrants tended to settle in the North and not the South because there were more opportunities there economically. In the South, 90% of the eligible population served. However, the North simply had more people. 22 million in the North to only 5.5 million free whites in the South. That's hugely significant. I mean, that's just math. They have a ton more manpower. Additionally, the North controlled 90% of the nation's industry. We've talked about this when we talked about the market revolution in the country and why it occurred mostly in the North and not in the South. Additionally, the Northern railway system was twice that of the South. So not only are they producing more, but they're able to transport goods more easily. So if troops need supplies, they can do that more easily than the South can because the South has less railway lines. Consequently, the North had more money. Additionally, Lincoln had an established structure and organization in his government. He doesn't need to create a government from scratch. They have one already in existence. Also, Lincoln's personality was a better fit for leadership than Jefferson Davis, who is going to be president of the Confederacy. So again, Jefferson Davis is elected presidency of the Confederacy. He has to build a government from scratch, which of course is no easy feat. If you remember back to some of our very first lectures, we failed at our first attempt to form a government, the Articles of Confederation. So it's not easy to do, number one, and certainly not, number two, not easy to do in the midst of a civil war. However, in terms of the South's advantages, the North had to come in and conquer the South, while the South just had to defend their territory. And so because of that, they didn't have to move their troops and supplies as far, and it's far easier to defend your territory than it is to come in and conquer it. So from that military aspect, they definitely have the advantages. Additionally, the South had much better military leaders, as we'll see, until Ulysses S. Grant is put in charge of the Union Army, it's like a revolving door of generals for the Union. They just can't seem to find one that's going to be a good fit. Whereas the South, this is just where all the better military leaders happen to be. Additionally, Southern farmers were better fighters than Northern professionals and factory workers. Of course, there's farmers in the North as well. But the South is much more agricultural. And if you live on a farm, chances are you hunt, you're familiar with a gun, you're familiar with sleeping outside, being outside. And so that gives them the advantage as well. So their advantage is really militarily. We won't get into all the battles of the Civil War. This would be a very long lecture, number one. And number two, this is not a military history class. If you wanted to look into that, you could take a military history class later on in your career. So we'll just focus on a few. So the first Battle of Bull Run is the first major battle after Fort Sumter. It takes place in July of 1861, where Union forces under the control of McDowell are going to confront Confederate soldiers under Beauregard at Manassas in Virginia. At First Battle of Bull Run, the Union seemed to be headed towards victory, but wound up losing due largely to the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. He actually earned his nickname here. His name was not actually Stonewall. It's said that as the Union troops came charging at him, he stood there like a stone wall, so that's his nickname. Now, the significance of Bull Run is not necessarily who won or who lost, but the fact that it dispelled a lot of illusions about the war. People no longer thought it would be a short war and started to realize this is going to be a long haul. It also boosted Southern confidence in their superior military ability, which, remember, that is their main advantage. So General George McClellan commands the Union Army in the East at first. And he is going to have the distinction of being fired not once but twice by Lincoln, mainly because he tended to drag his feet. He delayed in attacking the South, claiming his troops needed more training. There's going to be a couple times where he really loses the advantage in pursuing Robert E. Lee, who is the head of the Confederate Army. And so because of that, as we'll see, he's going to be replaced twice. All right, Antietam. This is another battle that we'll talk about. Lee hoped that a Confederate victory in the North would encourage Britain to support the Confederacy. So this would have been huge, because remember, what are the South's disadvantages? Well, they lack manpower and they lack resources. Britain has both. Britain at the time is the largest empire in the world. They have tons and tons of manpower and resources that they could use to support the Confederacy. Now, why did the South even think that Great Britain would support them? Well, Great Britain has a lot of textile factories that produce cloth that make Great Britain a lot of money. Where do they get a majority of their cotton? You guessed it, the South. So their idea is it would be in their best interest to support the Confederacy. And Great Britain's dragging their feet on this. And so the idea is, well, if we score a major victory on Northern territory, they will see that we have the ability to win this war. And so they try, and the result is the Battle of Antietam, which happens in Maryland in September of 1862. It was a tactical draw, but McClellan, who has been restored, was able to find a copy of Lee's battle plans and force Lee back to Virginia. Now, he could have pursued Lee because Lee was in a weakened position here, but he didn't. And because of that, he was removed for the last time by Lincoln. But the significance of Antietam is that it helps the North because it stopped the Confederacy from getting the help from Great Britain. Again, they were dragging their feet. They were not in support of slavery at this point in time in their history, so they weren't sure about that. And this failure to win a battle on Northern soil convinces them not to help, which again would have been disastrous for the North. Photography is going to play a huge part in this war. It's one of the first times that photographs of the battlefield are taken and are circulated around, and people can physically see actual images, not paintings or anything like that, of what the battle looked like and just the horror and the devastation. And again, seeing that it's not all about, glory and honor and these battles are these great and wonderful things. No, people are actually suffering and dying, and it's horrible. All right, so McClellan is replaced by the even more disastrous General Ambrose Burnside. That's his picture down there in the lower corner. Fun fact, the term sideburns is actually named after this guy for obvious reasons if you look at his picture. Burnside recklessly attacked Lee at the Battle of Fredericksburg in Virginia. in which he lost 12,000 Union men to the Confederacy's 5,000 because he didn't realize that heroic charges against troops in trenches was a disaster with new and improved weapons. And that's going to be a huge issue in the Civil War. We have largely improved weapons that are easier to use and they're deadlier, but we still have these old battle tactics being used in which we're charging across open fields, and the result is just a bloodbath. So the Anaconda Plan, one of the Union's more successful long-term plans is going to be to cut off supplies coming in from southern ports. Remember, the South does not have industry, and they don't have a lot of transportation, so they have to import a lot of products in order to keep going. And so the idea is, well, if we cut off those importations, their ability to get supplies in and out, that's going to be a huge blow to them, and we can basically starve them into giving up. It's called the Anaconda Plan because that's, of course, a snake, and that's how a snake kills its prey. And so that was their idea. And so in order to do this, they need to have some naval victories. And so one such is going to be the Confederate ship, the Merrimac, finding the Union ship, the Monitor, in March of 1862, which resulted in a draw. But the Union blockade does continue, and it does prove successful in the end. The war in the West is largely under the control of General Ulysses S. Grant, a West Point graduate who also fought in the Mexican War. And he is eventually going to be placed in charge of all Union troops, mainly because of all his successes. He captured the strategic forts of Henry and Donelson in the West. He won victories in Shiloh in Tennessee and Corinth, Mississippi. In the meantime, Admiral General David Farragut led a naval force that captured New Orleans. Huge issue for the South because New Orleans is one of the major ports in the South. Not only is it on the Gulf of Mexico, it's also on the Mississippi River. I remember waterways are hugely significant in transporting goods at the time. So the fact that the Union now controls New Orleans is a huge blow to the Confederacy. Meanwhile, the fall of Memphis meant that the only major river town remaining in Confederate hands was Vicksburg, which will also be captured by the Union Army. So the human toll of the war is just astounding. Heavy losses really start changing soldiers' views of the war. Again, early on, people are excited. There's a lot of enthusiasm. They think that war is going to be this glorious thing. And then there's this sobering prospect of there's a very good chance that you could die or you could be captured. Additionally, the conditions of medical care did not improve wounded soldiers' survival chances. Disease was a major cause of death. If there's one thing you can be grateful for living in the age that we do, it is modern medical science. And I think that recent events with the pandemic and whatnot have definitely shown us that. But certainly if you look at what they were working with at the time, I mean, they had no concept of germs. And that is how people got sick, and that's how people got infections. And so, if you had to have a battlefield operation, which was common, you need an amputation. So the bullet that they used at the time was called a mini ball. And what it would do is shatter your bone. And if your bone is shattered to that extent, that the kind of damage that the mini ball would do, you can't do anything. You have to have amputation. So they knew how to do amputations, but if you had to have one like on the battlefield, they'd give you some alcohol and something to bite down on, and they would just cut your arm or your leg off and go from patient to patient. Even if you were in a field hospital and were able to have chloroform to kind of knock you out, they would just go from patient to patient with these tools and not properly sterilize them because, of course, they didn't know. And so the result is that you would likely get an infection, which would turn into gangrene, and you die. Very few people were able to make it through. And in addition, again, you're in an army camp. Other kinds of diseases will just sweep through. There's no vaccines. There's no antibiotics. So if you do get an infection, you're SOL, for lack of a better term. I mean, disease really killed a huge number of people in the war. But women on both sides played major roles in tending to the wounded and taking over the role of nurse, which wasn't seen as a woman's role up until this point. So by July of 1862, Lincoln had decided that now would be the time to free the slaves, and Antietam made him take action. So on September 22nd, 1862, he stated, that states said that all slaves in the Confederate States were henceforth and forever free as of January 1st, 1863. It rhymes, so it makes it easy to remember. And on this date, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So note that he does not free the slaves in the border states. He is only freeing the slaves in rebellious states. He does, however, urge slave owners in the border states to come up with their own plan of emancipation. Eventually, the 13th Amendment will be passed and will officially outlaw all slavery in the United States. But he doesn't do this because he doesn't want the border states to leave the Union. So the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation, well, it enlarged the purpose of the war for the North. Now they're fighting against something that is a moral issue, as slavery, not just rebellion or secession. Additionally, newly freed slaves could now fight for the North. Of the approximately 180,000 black soldiers and 20,000 black sailors who fought for the Union, over 80% were from the South, were soldiers who left, took advantage of their newly found freedom, and wanted to fight for the Union. They still face discrimination. If you continue on with your history classes and you take the second section of this class, you will learn more about that, but still fought valiantly. All right, so some turning points. Vicksburg, which remember is captured by the Union after a siege. That is a major port town on the Mississippi River. So again, the idea is to cut off supplies coming in from the South. Also, Confederate forces were able to confine the Union Army at Chattanooga. However, Union reinforcements were able to break the siege, forcing the Confederate Army to retreat into Georgia. In the West, several Native American tribes continued to battle Union forces for land and resources. From their perspective, it would be a good time to take advantage of an obvious weakness within the United States. Anything that divides and weakens the nation is a good thing for the Native Americans. Also, Confederate hopes for securing Texas fell short as the Union naval blockade tightened because they just don't have the resources to spare for that effort. Also taking advantage of their clear majority, because all the southern states, which are largely Democrats at this time, are gone and aren't represented in Congress, the Republicans are like, well, hey, let's get some laws that we want to see passed through. So to boost the economy, the Republicans did the following. They passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered lands in the Great Plains region for free for anyone who could agree to farm it for 5 years. And again, if you continued on with this, they'd talk about the significance of that afterwards. The Morrill Tariffs and Land Acts passed high tariffs to help American businesses and also encouraged governments to give land to colleges. So if you plan on transferring to a 4-year university after this, many of them were built shortly after this, taking advantage of this act. And the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 laid the way for the first transcontinental railroad. All right, the Northern economy. Though wages are going to increase during the war because things are needed for the war effort, and so there's going to be a demand for workers, prices rose higher. That's, again, supply and demand. A lot of the supplies are going to be going to the war effort and are not available for everyday purchase, and so they become scarce. The prices go up. This revives the trade union movement. By 1865, 200,000 Northern workers belonged to union. Unfortunately, the prospect of large profits bred a lot of greed and corruption. A lot of profiteers traded with the enemy. They swindled the government. They sold shoddy goods to the army, guns that backfired, things like that, trying to take advantage of the need that was in the country at the time. And a lot of people grew very, very wealthy as a result of this. Well, a lot of the famous robber baron families of the Gilded Age, this is how they made their money. However, the Northern economy fed, clothed, and armed the Union soldiers and kept most civilians employed and well-fed, which was not the case for the South. More than 100,000 Northern women had to work in various industries during the war. This is the case with pretty much all wars. With the men gone, women have to take control and step into roles that would be considered a man's role in peacetime. Women also worked in the expanding government bureaucracy and as nurses. However, the war often also left thousands of women widowed in a very precarious position in a time in which there was no social safety net from the government providing economic assistance. However, the new economic opportunities created by the war opened up women's options, including admissions to higher education, which really start opening up after the Civil War. All right, in the South, as the Confederacy starts to disintegrate, politically, Southern politics is hindered by dissent, and it grew stronger as the Confederacy's fortunes declined. Again, they are unable to get supplies in or out, and that's going to create a lot of tension as people are going to start literally becoming hungry. States' rights was also a major obstacle to the development of central authority, because one of the reasons why they seceded from the Union was to fight for stronger states' rights. They now can't have, by default, a strong central government, and that's very difficult to manage in wartime. Because there were no political parties, Davis also could not appeal to party loyalty to control dissent, and calls for peace were arising as early as 1863. And ironically, attempts by Davis and other Confederate leaders to build a strong sense of Confederate nationalism failed. And I say ironically because there are still pockets of the country where people, will fly a Confederate flag, and that's still around to this day. But at the time, it was very difficult to arouse that patriotism once the war started to really get tough. By 1863, the South also experienced difficulty feeding its population, and that means not just soldiers, but people, because remember, there's a blockade going on. Bread riots broke out in Mobile, Atlanta, and Richmond. Those are people rioting because they literally have nothing to eat. As the war progressed, Southern soldiers had threadbare uniforms with many garments and weapons taken from the Union. They would literally take things right off of dead bodies because they had no better option. And their families suffered under similar conditions. When the armies would come through, it was not good for you if they were coming through the area in which you were living. Again, sometimes battles would literally be fought in people's backyards. And Confederate armies threatened civilians with robbery, rape, and even murder. Additionally, many slaves, unsurprisingly, stopped working and abandoned the plantations. I say unsurprisingly to us, but to the plantation owners, it was very shocking. They expected, for some reason, loyalty. Again, no concept that slavery would be offensive to them. They viewed it as being, they were taking care of their slaves. In the South, many Southern women had to manage plantations and work in the fields alongside slaves. And remember, when we talked about culture in the South, it was seen as, for these, the 4% that was very wealthy, this was not something that a well-bred Southern lady would do, go out in the fields and work, but yet they had to. Southern women also worked in factories, making uniforms, munitions, and in government offices. They often taught school. And as the war continued, many women had to help their deserting husbands and relatives elude Confederate authorities. Desertion was and is a federal offense, and at the time was punishable by death. And so these soldiers had to be hidden. And by 1864, many Southern women had tired of the war. So, Grant's plan to end the war. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed commander of the Union forces, finally one who's going to be successful. He coordinated a war effort that changed the tempo of the war, and this was his strategy, to hammer the enemy continuously. Remember, they're low on supplies already, so if we can just fight them, it doesn't even matter if we win or lose. If we just fight them as often as we can, they're going to run out of supplies and they're going to have to surrender, and they're going to run out of manpower too. So that was his strategy. Meanwhile, General Sherman was advancing through Georgia, and Grant's major focus was on Robert E. Lee. At the Battle of Wilderness, Grant surprised Lee by not withdrawing after both sides endured heavy casualties. Again, this is going to lead to a lot of criticism that Grant is putting, strategy ahead of men's lives. But that is his strategy. We just have to keep at it, and eventually they're going to surrender. Meanwhile, Sherman moved Georgia and captured Atlanta, and it is Sherman's his tactic to just burn everything that he sees. He burns all major cities, plantations as he goes in a kind of shock and awe campaign. Still, there is an election in 1864, a presidential election. Surprisingly, George McClellan is going to oppose Lincoln in the 1864 election. However, the fall of Atlanta and later victories boosted support for Lincoln, who won the election. Taking advantage of his popularity, he seized the 13th Amendment, officially outlawing slavery, passed in 1865. So that means for everybody, including the border states. In the meantime, General Sherman marched from Atlanta all the way to the coast, leaving ruin and devastation in his wake. Again, just tearing up railway lines, burning things, just completely wreaking havoc on the South. Some Confederate leaders at this point get desperate and proposed arming the slaves, but unsurprisingly, the remaining slaves responded with very little enthusiasm. So Lee's army remained an obstacle to Union victory. He abandoned the defense of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital. That also fell to Union forces, but still he refused to surrender. Grant's army finally caught up with Lee's forces at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where Lee does surrender, ending the war. In Washington, the celebration of the end of the war was muted by the assassination of Lincoln, which takes place a few days later. So, to conclude, the Civil War caused over 1 million casualties, dead and wounded. It leaves the South completely devastated. 1 in 4 men of fighting age between 20 and 40 had died. 40% of the livestock were lost, and so was half the farm machinery, which is devastating to an agricultural economy. However, the Union victory solved the constitutional problem of secession because it ended slavery. So no longer is secession an option. As Lincoln saw it, once you're in the Union, you're in. There's no getting out, and that is how it remains to this day. And again, it ended slavery. For Black Southerners, emancipation was the conflict's most important result. The Civil War will also stimulate a host of diverse changes that unfold over time and that we are still seeing developing to this day.